Hello.
Oh, hi.
Daphne. For anyone who wasn't here earlier, I'm Tracey Camilleri from Oxford Saïd. I'm an associate fellow there and the director of the Oxford Strategic Leadership Programme.
And I'm Brittingham. I'm SVP of Global Talent and Organization Development. For FCB, we are, my voice just got loud. We are a large advertising agency with offices globally, headquartered in New York.
So over the next 20 minutes, we're going to take you on a gallop and through 12 pictures, hope to tell you the story of a program, a short, week-long program that we designed for a global CEO and his 24 business leaders in Oxford, and to give you a sense of, I suppose, what our nervousness was, what we learned, what happened, what worked, and a little bit about what didn't.
Yes. So this was a really interesting time in my organization. I think we're on the next slide. Yeah. So advertising, the industry is really good at thinking about brands, thinking about activation, thinking about events, and very accustomed to putting on big splashy events. What we knew with this is that we had to do something different. We needed to approach it differently. And so there were two main goals. One, we wanted to really develop our leaders using an outside-in process, not just learning from each other, but learning from the outside. And two, we wanted to co-create the future. We talked earlier in one of the sessions about disruption. Well, certainly our agency, the advertising world, is being hugely disrupted. So a big piece of this was, one, develop leaders, and two, co-create the future and figure out what it needs to be and what our organization needs to be in that picture.
Just trying to think while we're in the next one. So I had the job as the outsider to interview everyone before they came about what were their leadership challenges, what were they grappling with. And it became clear to both of us that the best way to structure this thing was to flip the classroom and to make their challenges the content of the program, and for us to provide different lenses, different perspectives, different provocations that would enable them to reframe those challenges during the course of the week.
And so while Tracey got to do all that fun stuff, which is the great part of building a program, is you interview all the people and you really hear directly. I mean, she heard from each one of our leaders in all of the locations and was feeding back to me, here's what's coming up. And meanwhile, I was back in the office dealing with lots of politics, trying to reassure my leaders and the team kind of behind the scenes that even though this was a completely different way of doing things, it was going to be good. I promise you. And so that it was really, really interesting. I think one of the reasons I was excited about coming here to share this case study is that we really built a remarkable amount of trust in the process. I was sharing with her my internal challenges and how I was navigating the political landscape of actually pulling this off. And she was sort of learning from my population and feeding back to me. And so it was a very responsive co-creation of the design that worked really well.
And for those of you who are here this morning, there was a deal of good, productive fear as well going on between us.
Absolutely.
So with a lot of big beasts in the room, we decided that our key tool would be two-way conversation, structured conversation. And so we pillaged the Oxford University mode of Socratic tutorials. And so we had a stratum of small group tutorials running through the week. And we chose a fabulous team of Oxford tutors very deliberately with extremely different backgrounds. So we had a professor of strategy, we had a psychologist, we had an improv specialist, we had a leadership specialist, and so on, so that we would provide them with very, very different inputs and a very different sounding board through the course of the week. And also that those small groups would allow them the opportunity to offer one another their expertise. I'm talking about the participants here and their learning to share with one another.
And it's interesting. I mean, I think any time that you design a learning session with small groups, you can get extremely forensic and specific about who's in what group and to what end and how is that going to gel and what is that going to do. And of course, this was no exception. What was fascinating to me, again, I was doing a lot of educating and learning myself internally as we were getting the program ready to launch, was how much the process itself enabled the learning. So I thought about it as an organizational intervention, actually. We were focused in on how to develop leaders and how to think about the future. At the same time, there was meta-level learning going on. So I was able to, just in the process of saying, hey, here's how we want to think about the groups, to demonstrate to the leadership, this is a way to think about how to maximize an event for learning, as opposed to just an event for the sake of having an event. So creativity. Anybody who's been familiar with the advertising industry will know that creativity is the absolute core of the business. We have a creative department, we have a global chief creative officer, everything is about creativity. Ironically though, the thing that is your biggest strength can become a weakness, and it can block your vision. And Tracey and I talked a lot about this in the design of the program, but one of the things we set out to do was kind of demystify or break down the mythology of creativity that has built up in the organization. And so turning that to Tracey's amazing, design expertise and everything that Oxford had to offer was incredible.
Well, we decided to use the whole kind of theatre of the university and to send them off in small groups to kind of discover how different bits of the university thought about creativity. So a small group, for example, went to All Souls, just 3 of them, to talk with a mathematical biologist about how she saw the maths of how pandemics spread as being an absolutely creative thing to do. We sent them, 3 of them, to talk to a classicist in Jesus College, built in the 16th century, to talk about how the ancient Greeks thought about innovation. We had them in the Ashmolean talking to a sculptor about how his creativity came from the materials he used. They worked with a games designer to think about the notion of play and rules, with a social entrepreneur, with a historian to think about how historians produce narrative out of fragments, out of little bits of archive. And then we asked them to come back together again to teach one another and to see what different ideas that had brought to their concept of what it was to be a creative. So just to give you a sense of how we addressed some of these questions.
This is, anybody know what this is? I did not either. It's actually a calendar that was developed by Inuit Indians. It's made of whale bone, and it was used to keep time. And in reality, it's about that big. And it sits among millions of objects in the most remarkable museum I think I've ever been in, called the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. And this was a very special part of the program. We had the museum to ourselves, and got into small groups, and the leaders were sort of wandering around, and we had a list of things that we had to find and locate and then think about. And when we debriefed the experience, this was one of the objects, what came out of a simple whale bone was amazing relevance to the business about how do we value time, how do you put a value on creativity, how do you measure time? I mean, all of our employees globally fill out timesheets every day about what they've been working on, and that's how we bill for our services. Does that make sense? I mean, we were really tearing apart the real foundations of how the business worked and how we bill, and it was inspired by this. So to me, it was an amazing way to open people up to think about the mundane every day. I mean, people roll their eyes about timesheets, but to think about that in a new way, and that was what this experience did.
And talking of time, just connecting with the leaders before they came, it was clear that their time and their attention was hourly, daily, under assault. And we wanted to create a program, yes, that was time in for them, so it was relevant, it was connected to what they were grappling with, but also time out for them to think long thoughts, to have different kinds of conversations. And so again, we really thought about designing places for structured reflection. So we had walkshops rather than workshops, where we made them walk from one place to another in a structured way and have different sorts of conversations. We had meditation. We gave them very analog journals, and they had to look at their handwriting and write with pens. So all kinds of things. We had poetry as well. So really thinking about giving them time to step back and think about some of the why questions, not only the what and the how questions.
And I'll just remember one specific moment that was really powerful in my mind. After a long day of wherever we happened to be that day, there was activities packed in. The team built a bonfire out in back of the place we were staying. And so you'd walk up a little hill, there were torches, and everybody walked up to the bonfire, and each of the leaders, if they wanted to, they had brought their favorite poems. And we read poems to each other, and it was so meaningful. One of our leaders, our leader of our West Coast office in the US, started breaking out in song. And it sounds kind of hokey, but it was very, very special. And what I could see as this week went along, these experiences that were so unique and different were building the bonds of trust with this group, and it was very powerful.
We knew that they'd come in as well with their kind of mental inboxes filled to overflowing, and kind of no space in the hard drive, if you will. And so again, deliberately felt that the design of the program needed to be as immersive and visceral as possible in order to make sure that they were present, truly present. We heard this morning about what it was like sometimes, not to be wholly there, and also to get their attention. And so we drew a lot on the humanities, actually, in this program.
And it worked beautifully because the folks in my industry, we are part of a corporate structure, but we kind of are allergic to corporate stuff. I think due to the influence of creativity, there's a lot of artists in my business tend to, I don't want to be too corporate. And so they respond more to stories than they do case studies. And so we actually used Shakespeare. We used a 400-year-old story of The Tempest to talk about the storm of disruption that the industry is going through and what that meant. And it's remarkable. Tracey knows all of the good providers of stuff, but looking at each character in the story and how that's an archetype for leadership and what does that mean. And it was, I think we spent a good 3/4 of a day on The Tempest, and it was so rich and meaningful. So again, a real different way of thinking about what's happening, how to tell the story of that, how to use a case study that's ancient but so relevant.
An experiment that certainly I hadn't done before was to have this group of tutors alongside and there all the way through the week. And we realized that, yes, we wanted to look at some strategic challenges, but one of the things we were looking at was actually the dynamics between the top team. And so to have the tutors there all the way through as supporters, sounding boards, provokers, readers of what was happening was very powerful, and their ability as a team to give feedback in the moment to a team was something that I hadn't done before, and particularly as they came at it from such different perspectives, a psychologist, a professor of strategy, and that, yes, that was an experiment that we hadn't done, but was very, very powerful, that they experienced the dynamics of how the team worked as well as what was going on.
Yeah, and I think what it did was it took things that were happening and turned it into learning in the moment. And one thing that was very powerful, we had intentionally, and it was scary, left the last day completely empty, knowing that so much was going to be generated over the first 3 days that it would be hard to pre-predict that. So the last day was to be just us without the Oxford faculty, and what was it going to be? And so on the final day we had with Tracey and the tutors, we sat around the lunch table, Carter, my worldwide CEO, and I just watched him soak in all of these different perspectives. Like, he was just taking it all in, and it was fascinating. And it led to this amazingly rich and energized final day. And the 4 teams that we created on that final day are still doing work today. So this happened a year ago. So I feel like that's pretty good. So impact, this, I love this visual, breaking the frame, right? I think that when I think about the impact, the fact that we have these 4 teams, they're still running now, we were able to show how you can do an event differently and make it be about learning and how enriching that is. I personally know from my perspective that one of the things I learned is that even I tend to focus on how much is still inside. Like, oh, we have so much more to go. But the good news is we made so much progress. There's new ways of looking. We still have our old frame, but we're looking and seeing things differently. And that's been a huge value to the organization and to the individual leaders.
Yeah, and just very quickly, because it'd be great to have a few questions at the end. For me, having a CEO in the classroom, if you're thinking about impact and what happens afterwards, as a student, was hugely efficient and hugely powerful. I think I had never done the design an empty day at the end of a program. So we had the container with nothing in it, and to hold the faith that we'd be able to put into that what emerged from those discussions. And my colleagues probably in other business schools do that, but I hadn't done that before. I think, to meditate in the dark in winter as the birds are singing with 24 people from across the globe, is quite an extraordinary experience. There was a lot of learning there for me. But do we have time for a few questions?
Do you want to show the next slide?
We have 3 minutes and 20. Look at that, hands are going up really quickly.
Yeah.
So you can have my mic and go for
it. How long does it last, and how do you measure the results?
Right, how long?
Well, it lasted a week, but...
It's a really good question about measuring results. I think it was immediate impact, and of course you do the evaluations, and the people saying this changed my life, this was amazing. For me personally, I think it's about the work of those 4 teams and making sure it continues, and seeing it feed into our strategy. So we're having another big global meeting in March, and those threads will be pulled through. And so that, to me, is my measure of success.
That's a great one. Do they still want to be together? That's lovely, Brian.
Sounds like you created some really beautiful learning experiences during those days. I am interested in what next. I know you have talked to a little bit, but in terms of sustaining that, what formally, obviously there's natural continuation, but what formal intentional interventions have you been doing to embed that in the business practice, not outside of the business practice?
Yep. So I think there's a couple of examples. I have pulled pieces out of that program and put them into other programs that we run. So I built a high potential leadership program for the next level down, and we used some of that content. We have something called a brand bedrock process that we use for clients to help clients get clear what's the core purpose of your brand. And we did that on ourselves as a direct outgrowth of this. And then from that, there's an initiative to do some scenario planning. So those are sort of the ways it's carrying through.
Could I say something? I mean, I think we talked, anyone who's next door before, talked about the trough of despair, and I think that people came out with huge amount of energy and excitement. You said it was a beautiful thing. And I think that when you hit the difficulty of some of the things that they were doing, I think if some learning from me, if I was to design it again, I would have designed some kind of continuity with those coaches that they formed those close relationships to hold them through that next stage. So I think that was, from my perspective, design perspective, a piece of learning.
So one of the certainly problems we've found with, or challenges for educating CEOs, is they normally have the view that they don't really have anything to learn. So part of, and I see you've managed very well with this program, is to disguise the fact that they're actually learning, but they're just kind of sharing experiences. And that presumably is also one of the hurdles on doing follow-up, because you can't say you're following up the learning because, of course, there wasn't any learning, was there?
Well,
So how do you cope with those issues?
We were very worried about that.
Yeah.
And actually, that's why we really symbolically, and we had a lot of conversations with the global CEO about actually, the flat hierarchy, where you don't constrain people floundering around and saying, I don't know. You need to be a student. And we really did choreograph him literally walking across and we said, right, we're in charge now, no pressure, God. And so he actually had to kind of acknowledge he was there to learn as a learner, and symbolically that spread, and there was a lot of Instagramming of him in the classroom, which is quite good.
Carter is the Instagram CEO. He's posting all the time.
Yeah.
But the other way, I think, I'm very lucky because everything looked beautiful. We had a logo, we had, it just was beautiful visually. And so that visual reminder, I might send something out and I include the logo. So it triggers in people's minds that association. So the program has a brand that sticks. And so that helps, I think, reinforce that visceral experience that they had.
Bit of stealth, a little bit of sort of, allure, I suppose. I'm going to take one from the, because people have been good enough to put one into the app. Was the initiative aligned with the, there's 3 there, that's a bit cheating, but there you go. Was it aligned with the company culture beforehand? Would it work everywhere? And how was it aligned? So you could say yes, no, and yes, no to that, I think. Just to help you a bit,
Oh.
Could I say something there? Because, we're Oxford.
As long as it's yes or no.
We're Oxford. This American advertising agency came over, and there was one point when you wanted to have banners outside the university church, and I became incredibly schoolmarmy. I was going, no. But actually, I think what we managed to find was a way of bringing our cultures together, and I think it was through this kind of visual beauty that we decided that we would create something very beautiful that
So
actually
yes.
crossed over. So
That's a yes. Would it work everywhere? What would you say to that? Yes?
It was
adapted?
custom built for us. So I guess I would say I would trust the Oxford team.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that there's a lot of elements to blend.
Principles and adaptation, I would say, yeah. And don't bother with the last one because we'll be here forever.
Yeah.
Is that it? We have got to finish. But what we obviously have to do is thank our wonderful speakers for the story. Brilliantly done, thank you.